They can only feel good about themselves when the external world gives confirmation that they are amazing, right? So I'm talking about emotional regulation today. First, we're going to talk about how narcissists, especially covert narcissists, emotionally regulate themselves. And when you hear this, you're going to be like, yes, this makes so much sense. It's going to feel validating. And then we're going to shift into how victims of narcissistic abuse emotionally regulate. And that's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. At least it did for me. Because when we're starting to look at our wounds, it becomes uncomfortable in the body. So we're going to talk about why in this video as well. We're also going to discuss what makes it so hard to emotionally regulate, whether you're a narcissist or not. And last but not least, what does healthy emotional regulation look like and how can we get there? Yes, this is a lot. So grab something to drink, grab a snack, and join me because honestly, I feel like this topic is so important for anyone that's been in a relationship or grew up around narcissistic family systems. So let's dive in. For those that don't know me, my name is Michele. I'm a survivor myself of narcissistic abuse. I'm now a trauma-informed coach and a somatic experiencing practitioner. I'm also the founder of the School of Transformation, where I meet live on Zoom with victims of childhood trauma, narcissistic abuse, complex PTSD from all over the world. We meet live on Zoom weekly. So if you're looking for more personal, interactive assistance as you're healing, make sure you check out the School of Transformation. Let's talk about how narcissists, especially covert narcissists, regulate themselves. Narcissists regulate through the external world. They can only feel good about themselves when the external world gives confirmation that they are amazing, right? Thus, their incessant need for narcissistic supply. And so when they are focusing on that external validation or that narcissistic supply, they don't show up as who they really are. They don't act in harmony with how they're really feeling at that moment. Rather, they polish their self-image or what people think about them. So they show people what people want to see so as to get the praise from that individual. This is why a narcissistic parent is loved by everyone but their own children, or a narcissistic spouse is admired by everyone else's spouse or their friends and not their own spouse, especially with a covert narcissist, because they're showing up with what they know people want to see in a way that would make people admire them. So they are anything but authentic. And so often covert narcissists can seem very altruistic and as if they do so much for other people. But in reality, there is a motive to that. In fact, if there was no audience and no one to admire what they do, they would not do it. So they're really doing all of these things that make people look at them as if they give so much for that very purpose, to be seen that way, not because it's who they really are. And here's where it gets frustrating if you're in a relationship with somebody like that, or if this is your parent, because everyone is admiring this person for all the things they do and these characteristics that they are displaying. But what they don't know is that those characteristics and those actions are reserved for people outside of the family or outside of the immediate people they're living with. I used to say, when it came to one narcissist in my life, I used to say that all of their good, they would hang up almost like a coat, right? It's winter, you come into your house, you put the coat on the coat hanger. Well, they put all their characteristics, they leave it at the door when they enter the house. And so you don't see those things, only people outside of the home do. So that's how they upregulate themselves with flying monkeys. But let's talk about how they upregulate themselves within the confinements of the home. And this is a darker, more insidious way that they emotionally regulate themselves. Because narcissists live life through this polished self-image that they show the world instead of through who they really are, they never learn how to notice the things they don't like about themselves and work on them. So we talked about how they upregulate by making other people see how amazing they are. But there's something else they do when they do come face to face with things they don't like about themselves. And again, it's still using the external to regulate. So what happens is, if a narcissist, for example, feels shame and they notice it, even unconsciously, they're like, ooh, I'm noticing this shame. What they will tend to do is, especially towards the scapegoat of the family, which could be one of the children or the spouse, anyone in the family can take that role. They will cause the scapegoat to feel that. They will provoke intentionally and they will not stop. So if they're trying to shame you and you don't respond, they will continue on and on and on until they can get that reaction, because they need you to feel shame so that they can fool themselves. In their mind, the second they see that you feel shame, there's like the switch goes off and they're like, oh, yeah, there was that shame there, but look, it's on him or her. They're feeling shame. I'm good. They've just emotionally regulated themselves by flinging, projecting, and provoking that emotion in you so that they can feel better. And when they do this, it can be such a confusing conversation or disagreement with the narcissist, because they're accusing you of things that they're doing, or they're accusing you of feeling things that they're feeling, and no amount of evidence that you show them that this isn't you, that it is them, gets through. So you wind up getting sucked into a circular conversation that has no exit ramp. In fact, sadly, the more reactive you get in that kind of conversation, which is understandable because it is exasperating to be accused of things that are not true. But the more emotional expression you get, the more frustrated, the more outraged, the more angry you get, in their mind is confirming more and more that you're the problem. So we accidentally play into scenarios that are helping them to regulate themselves through their own negative emotions or bad behavior. So let's talk about how victims of narcissistic abuse emotionally regulate themselves when they're in a relationship, whether it's a work relationship or a significant other or family member, any kind of relationship with somebody that might be a covert narcissist. But before we get into that, I want to let you know that for anyone that leaves a question on my new Instagram account under any post, it doesn't matter which one, if you leave me a question, I will answer it this month with a video response here on YouTube. So if there's a specific question you would love to have answered and you're tired of hopping from video to video, from YouTuber to YouTuber, trying to find the answer to that question, leave it on my Instagram and I will send you a video. So let's get back into how victims of narcissistic abuse emotionally regulate themselves. And I'm not going to lie, this is the uncomfortable part. This is where it starts to kind of hit home. And when I first heard this, it stung. But the reality is that victims of narcissistic abuse often have the same wound as the narcissist, expressed differently. And so we too wind up emotionally regulating ourselves externally, just like the narcissist. For example, we also have a shame wound. And so something that helps us to upregulate from that shame is by trying to help people around us feel better. In fact, this is one of the main reasons why narcissists and victims of narcissistic abuse wind up so magnetically attracted to each other, because the narcissist needs someone to regulate them so they feel better, and victims of narcissistic abuse wind up needing to help someone to feel better in order to combat this shame wound. And how this shows up, and I want to stress this part because for me, it was hard for me to really digest that truth, right? But when I started seeing how it showed up in my life, I was like, I couldn't deny it, right? So one of the ways that it shows up is an inability to stay in your own energy if the narcissist is in a bad mood. For example, let's say I was happy doing something that I enjoyed, and the narcissist just enters the room, and obviously they hate anyone that's feeling happy because they can't really feel that emotion. So again, what do they do to regulate themselves? They kind of switch whatever they're feeling they want you to feel, and that makes them think they're happy. So what would happen is that negative energy would come in, and even if I said, like, are you upset? Is there something wrong? It was always like, no, everything's fine, but the energy would be intense. Right? To the point that my nervous system would feel uncomfortable and I would wind up stopping doing what I was doing or feeling like I was doing something wrong. And then the narcissist would suddenly get really happy and I was left feeling awful. Another way it shows up is when we are working really hard to make the other person happy to the extent that we are amputating pieces of ourselves, pieces of our authenticity. We're not living in harmony with our authentic self. We are trying to find the secret formula to make the other person happy. And by making them happy, and regulating them, it then regulates us. So let's talk about how victims of narcissistic abuse downregulate, right? So let's say we've been highly activated and our nervous system's way up here and we're feeling a lot of emotion, we're overreacting. Now in reactive abuse, to that point where we're all over the place emotionally. What usually winds up helping us to come down is when the narcissist finally either gives those crumbs of love or even lets up on the abuse, right? Even just a let up of abuse feels so good to our nervous system, and then we feel a little bit better. But our whole emotional state is intertwined with how the relationship is. And this could be, again, with a significant other. I've had clients that have been intertwined like this with a boss, a coworker, with their child. So it doesn't matter the relationship. But what happens is the whole focus of how you feel is dependent on how the relationship is. What woke me up when I was doing this was when I noticed it with the silent treatment. When I was getting the silent treatment, it felt like emotional torture. And I couldn't seem to feel better until we were okay. So pause a moment. And I know that it's very validating to see how narcissists emotionally regulate themselves through you, right? And how wrong that is and how painful that is. As we shift into how we are stuck regulating ourselves from the outside, it may feel uncomfortable, but it is also the first step to help us to shift from victim to survivor. So my main point in comparing both narcissists and victims of narcissistic abuse and how they regulate is to show that both are focused on the external. So let's talk about why. In reference to covert narcissists, a lot of covert narcissists grew up to be narcissists themselves, but they were also victims of narcissistic abuse by someone in their family. Now, they faced that wound by making themselves better than others in their mind. Whereas adult victims of narcissistic relationships wound up making others better than them, and they were less than. The absolute crazy reality is that both responses, whether you make yourself more than others or less than others, is a trauma response, and it's the fawn trauma response. When we're stuck in the fawn trauma response, we stifle who we really are. Remember, narcissists are anything but authentic. They show up how they think other people want them to be, and it's the same thing if we're on the codependent side, right? We often stifle our real self out of fear of rejection or abandonment, which is what happened when we were children. We were abandoned when we were authentic. Now, here's where things are different between victims of narcissistic abuse and narcissists. Again, focusing on covert narcissists. A covert narcissist can't reflect, can't look at this video and be like, ooh, yeah, I do that. They're not willing to feel the discomfort of the truth. Whereas victims of narcissistic abuse, once we've worked through what happened to us, that the narcissist did this, right? And this is how it affected us. And we start to notice that even though we understand it, we stay stuck, right? For a little while, until we start looking at this side of it. Victims of narcissistic abuse are willing to self-reflect, and that's what's needed in order to shift into healthy regulation. So let's talk about that. One definition of emotional regulation is that it is the ability to initiate, inhibit, or modulate your actions and responses that are triggered by your emotions. In other words, we can't control what comes up in our body, what emotion comes up, right? Just as much as we can't control the thoughts that come up into our mind. But what we can control or regulate is what we do when they do come up. And so for victims of narcissistic abuse, one of the most challenging things that we have to work through is the letting go of control, letting go of control of the narcissist's emotional regulation. In other words, if they're going to be mad because you're reading a book and you're happy, you let go of feeling the need to stop them from their emotional reaction. And the reason that's challenging is because their emotional reaction brings something up inside of you, right? It causes activation in your body. It causes discomfort. And the reason for that is because it touches on your unhealed trauma wounds, which cause you to feel emotionally triggered. When we're emotionally triggered, our response is a lot higher than the situation calls for. For example, Let's say somebody's touching my arm and I don't like it. Like they're in my space. I don't like this person. They're touching my arm. I'm not going to like it and I'm going to move their hand. But you better believe if they stick a finger in my eye, the way that I move them away from me is going to be way different. It's going to be highly intensified because it's touching on something that's painful. And so the reason I bring that up is because sometimes after we learn how to stop regulating the narcissist, we then try to regulate ourselves by trying to not react. Let me know in the comment section below if you've ever learned all of this information and was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to react. They're allowed to be upset and I'm still allowed to do something that I enjoy. I'm not going to react, only to wind up reacting or feeling like, I learned this should work, but it's not working. Let me know if this resonates with you. Trying to control your emotions without reacting doesn't work, just like trying to not react if somebody sticks their finger in my eye, right? It's impossible. When something is causing us pain, our body automatically responds. And so the real way we can shift into being able to learn how to emotionally regulate ourselves in a healthy way, one is by understanding that emotional regulation has to do with really noticing what's going on inside of your body, what emotion is coming up and why. Because oftentimes we wind up getting pulled into reactions with narcissists because they're touching on past unhealed wounds. If those unhealed wounds have been processed, obviously we're not going to like what the narcissist is doing, but we're not going to show up from that past wounded place. We're going to show up from the person we are today. So some things that are needed in order to shift into a healthy way of emotionally regulating ourselves is first to be able to have the awareness of what's going on inside of us, right? To be conscious instead of in our default unconscious patterns. That's one thing. Something else that's needed is to be able to tune into our emotions like a good friend and support them, where normally we wind up abandoning ourselves. There's so much self-abandonment with victims of narcissistic abuse because that's all we knew. Like in childhood, I didn't get emotionally supported. So what happens? We internalize that and we don't know how to be there for ourselves. Thus, we go outside of ourselves and we get stuck in those loops and those patterns. And the last thing I'm going to mention that's needed in order to shift into healthy regulation, and honestly, I don't think this is talked about enough in the realm of narcissistic abuse, but it's having the capacity to be with strong emotion. Now, what I mean by that is, I know with myself, in childhood, I wasn't allowed to feel certain things. So because I wasn't allowed to feel them, does that mean they didn't come up in my body? No, they did. And I repressed, and I suppressed, and I ignored, and I shoved them in a closet, right? You ever see a closet that's like filled floor to ceiling and you open the door and everything comes tumbling down? Well, every time a narcissist triggers you, that's what's happening with that emotion. Everything in the past that made you feel that way comes up inside of you like an eruption. The problem is that being with that charge that comes up in the body is not easy. Learning to work through this on our own is very challenging as well. That being said, if you're still watching this video, it's obvious that you are tired of the same patterns. You're tired of being triggered all the time. You're tired of feeling like you're out of control of your body. And so I wanted to invite you to check out the School of Transformation. I meet with survivors of narcissistic abuse, emotional trauma, complex PTSD, live every week on Zoom. There are 9 to 12 meetings to choose from. And for the next 5 months, from August until 2025, we're going to break down each month the 5 main components of complex PTSD, which to me, I feel like most of us that have undergone narcissistic abuse wind up suffering from. In fact, it's the CPTSD that keeps us feeling stuck even after the narcissist is gone. So each month we're going to break down one of those 5 components, starting with self-abandonment, harsh inner critic, toxic shame, social anxiety, and emotional flashbacks. There's a 20% off for the next 5 months. If you want to join and have each month at 20% off, the coupon code is HEALING. You just have to hit the link and put in the coupon code and you will get that 20% off. So I look forward to seeing you live in our Zoom meetings.